Today, we're diving into the origins of Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary figure from Vikings, and exploring where he might have actually come from. Some people think that Ragnar was Danish, and let's just say, not everyone agrees with that. But that's all right. Everyone seems to want a piece of Ragnar. He's one of the most iconic figures of the Viking Age, and it's no surprise that all the Scandinavian countries have some historical or legendary claim to him. The historical sources tend to lean more toward Denmark. That's what I'll be discussing in this video, looking at the evidence so you can decide for yourself. Let's start with the Icelandic stories. There are quite a few of them, and they consistently name Ragnar as the son of Sigurd, a Danish king who also ruled much of Sweden during his reign. While these stories don't always give pinpoint details, the general consensus seems to be that Ragnar may have been born and raised in Sweden, though still the son of a Danish ruler. Interestingly, one story even describes his mother as a Norwegian princess, and of course, many of these texts name 𝐼𝐸 as his wife, which ties in with the more well-known stories. The accuracy of these stories is a bit of a mystery, especially when it comes to certain legendary claims. For example, 𝐼𝐸, Ragnar's wife, is said to be the daughter of the mythical heroes Sigurd and Brynhildr. These characters supposedly lived in the Germanic regions that are now part of modern-day France, around the time of Attila the Hun. That would place them several centuries before the Viking Age even began. And this is where things get tricky with the Icelandic stories. While the stories about Ragnar are often considered some of the more historically grounded among the stories, they still contain plenty of fantastical elements, like dragons and other mythic figures, which makes it hard to separate fact from fiction. That said, many of these sources consistently trace Ragnar's lineage back to Danish royalty, which does provide a recurring theme across different accounts. Now, let's move on to another key source, Gesta Danorum by Saxo Grammaticus. This work is widely criticized for its historical inaccuracies and for blending fact with legend, particularly when describing pre-Christian traditions. Still, it's worth noting that within this text, Ragnar is identified simply as a Danish king. Interestingly though, this version of the story gives him a Norwegian father and a Danish mother. He rules from Denmark and is said to have led or sent his sons on expeditions across the Viking world, places like Norway, Sweden, 𝐾𝐸 Rus, England, and Scotland. According to this account, his sons not only fought in these lands, but were made rulers in some of them. Again, while Gesta Danorum might not be the most reliable historical record, it still contributes to the broader legend of Ragnar and his ties to Denmark. A relatively trustworthy source comes from the account of Adam of Bremen. Compared to many others, his writings are among the earliest, which gives them a bit more credibility, and once again, his version supports the idea that Ragnar was a Danish king, with his sons consistently tied to Danish rule, regardless of where their adventures took them. Here's a fun fact. If you've seen the TV series Vikings, the writers mostly drew inspiration from the Icelandic stories for Ragnar's story. On the other hand, The Last Kingdom seems to lean more heavily on the Danish accounts when portraying Ragnar Lothbrok. So depending on which show you prefer, you're getting a slightly different version of the legend. Another notable source is The History of the Normans by William of Jumièges, which is also one of the earliest references to Ragnar. Ragnar is once again presented as a Danish king in this source. It was apparently common at the time for Danish kings to send their sons abroad, partly to give them experience, and partly to keep them from interfering with their father's reign. According to this version, Ragnar did exactly that with Bjorn Ironside, who then went on to raid Francia and sail to the Mediterranean, just like in the stories many of us know, and pretty closely matched by what you see in the TV series. Next up is the source known as Ross. While it doesn't mention Ragnar by his full name, it does refer to Lothbrok, the Latinized form of his name. In this account, he's described as the father of a Norwegian king named Eyvind and his well-known brothers. These sons are said to have teamed up with the Danes to launch invasions into Francia and England. The source doesn't go into detail about Ragnar's ancestry, but it does suggest that by this time he had settled in Norway, likely in the homeland of his wife, 𝐼𝐸, where he raised his children. Another source, the Chronicle of Sven Ars, also provides limited information about Ragnar's origins. However, It does mention his name and states that his son Sigurd eventually took over the throne of Denmark. This chronicle is considered a very trustworthy source. Many of the more credible records seem to agree on a general theme. Ragnar likely had Danish roots, but may have lived in Norway or Sweden, possibly where his father held power. Some accounts even hint that Ragnar's goal was to return to Denmark to reclaim his ancestral legacy. That's the impression given by several of the most respected sources. To wrap things up, we also have some of the Frankish chronicles and annals, which mention a figure named Deus, who some scholars believe could be connected to Ragnar. In these texts, he's described as Norse, a term that was often used to refer to Norwegians. However, the tricky part here is that in these particular records, Ragnar isn't portrayed as a king. Instead, he's seen more as a commander or chieftain, supposedly leading forces on behalf of the Danish king Hrothgar. It's important to remember that many of these foreign sources didn't really distinguish between Danes, Norwegians, or Swedes. They tended to group them all together under the label Norse. So, figuring out precise ethnic or national identity from these accounts is difficult. Possibly the most reliable record of all is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. These texts were essentially written during the events they describe, spanning several generations as a kind of ongoing historical record. In these entries, we read about Ragnar's sons and the great heathen army, which invaded Anglo-Saxon England. But again, no specific origin is given. It's likely that the army was a mix of warriors from across Scandinavia. So, in the end, we're left with a lot of clues, but no definitive answers. There are also a few skaldic poems that mention Ragnar, although they don't provide any details about where he came from. I think that's just about all the main sources, but if I've missed any, feel free to drop them in the comments. Like I mentioned earlier, the sources we do have often contradict one another, and some are partly mythological. Even among historians, there's debate over whether Ragnar was a real person or more of a legendary figure possibly based on multiple individuals. Personally, I believe he was real, but with a name as common as Ragnar back then, it's very possible that the legends combined stories from several different people. And when these accounts were written down centuries later, it's not surprising that things got exaggerated or even misrepresented. Still, we shouldn't be too hard on those medieval writers. After all, even today, we see plenty of misinformation in the media. Some things never change. What we can say with confidence is that Ragnar's sons definitely existed. There are multiple reliable sources that document their actions, and most of them point toward Danish roots. It's true they moved extensively and carried out numerous raids. Certain sources also claim Ragnar held power in Sweden and was laid to rest there. All of that might be true, but when it comes down to where their ancestry and base of power were, the evidence mostly points to Denmark. But that's just my take on it. But honestly, you're free to believe what makes sense to you. Just don't get too worked up about it. Royal families, especially in Scandinavia, have a long history of marrying into other royal houses. It was completely normal back then. In fact, it was essential. When it came to marriage, status mattered a lot. Royals were expected to marry into other noble families of equal or higher rank. And since that pool was small, they often had to look beyond their own kingdom and form alliances through marriage with neighboring rulers. So yeah, maybe Ragnar was mostly of Danish blood, and that might have been his homeland, but it's very likely he had roots in multiple parts of Scandinavia. His background was probably a blend, a true mix of the North, and honestly, that's fine. Claim him as your own if you want, whether you're Norwegian, Danish, or Swedish. He belongs to all of us. No need to take it too personally. At the end of the day, we're all part of the same extended family. The modern borders we have now didn't exist back then. We all came from the same ancient Germanic tribes, sharing language, culture, and religion that stretch back thousands of years. So yeah, we're more connected than we sometimes realize. Sadly, some modern royal families seem to have completely disregarded centuries of tradition and heritage. But hey, we won't get into all that here. Historically, royal families didn't operate that way. Sure, they married across borders, but it was usually within neighboring kingdoms, and the unions were almost always between noble houses of equal status. That's part of why people in the past felt such deep loyalty to their monarchs. It was about legacy, honor, and noble lineage. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. In the end, it's up to you to interpret the sources however you like. I've just laid them out the way we always do, based on what the records actually say.